live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton, Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Thursday, August 6th, 2020. Time for yet another show. And I don't know. I was up a little early this morning, and I thought, this is great. I've got plenty of time to get ready for everything. And then, I don't know. I frittered the time away following you folks on Twitter, finding out what's of interest to you so we could cover some of it on today's show. Greg Dworkin has been spending the days, I guess, enjoying the luxury of having the whole house generator up, but unfortunately still without internet access, or at least robust enough internet access that he can access the show via Skype. So we'll be missing him again today. But glad everyone is safe and comfortable up in Connecticut. And, it's kind of exciting. We all heard the generator being installed, and it's nice to know that it's working, and it seems to be humming along nicely, and keeping them comfortable while they wait for the restoration of the rest of their utility services. Sorry to the folks, I guess, in the neighborhood who don't enjoy the luxury of such a generator. But it sounds like everyone is safe and just waiting for, like I said, restoration of service up there. That could take some time. There's a lot of people without power. I think just the other day when Greg first notified me about what the situation was, I think like half of the customer base of his power company, Eversource, and sometimes Source, however you want to refer to them. I'm told you can call them whatever you want. CJ, DJ, Eversource, whatever it may be. But they've got a lot of work to do, obviously, and have their, as they say, their work cut out for them. All right. Plenty to catch up on today. We spent a good amount of time yesterday working our way through some of the stories that we hadn't gotten to in the days before. But we can do largely the same. Lots of interesting events, certainly. The president is crazy as ever. Lots of interesting analysis about those events. And much to catch up on. We should probably just dive right into it. And as a matter of fact, my usual support screen's not yet quite all the way up, but here we are, at least finding Bill's morning tweet. That's a good crutch to go to early in the morning. Come on, computers, wake up. Let's get going. Daily Coast Radio is live now, he tells us, and join Kagro X. That's me. I'm going to join myself for 2 hours of the best. OMG, did you see what that idiot just confessed to on Twitter? East or west of the Mississippi. This is also true. I would venture to say we don't usually think of it in these terms, but I think it's the best north and south of the Mississippi as well. Now, the river runs largely north-south, but there's a point at the north. I think we could probably say Canada would qualify. North of the Mississippi, there are places south of the Mississippi. It's very ethnocentric of us, I guess, here in the United States to think of things only in terms of east or west of the Mississippi. It's a much wider world than all that. All right. It's not your fault, Bill. I don't think view this way. It's just that's the traditional use of the language. If nothing else, you're a traditionalist. Can we just settle on that? I think that's fairly clear. All right. Speaking of Maine, are we? I mean, we could be speaking of Maine. We're speaking of a person in Maine. And so let's just take it as Maine writ large, shall we? Greg sent me a note. You'll recall that we picked up on this story. Did we do this Monday? What day is it? It's like Thursday. I can't believe this weekend is all screwed up because of how much time I spent going back and forth to between here and Charlottesville over the last couple of days and then the weekend. And it's usually something I only do on weekends, and to have done it during the week is seriously disorienting. But I think Monday, or possibly, I guess, maybe last time we spoke last week, Thursday, it must have been last week, I guess. Remember that there was a pitch that Trump was making to the lobstermen of Maine. And we were not really sure how successful that was going to be. Well, now we have an answer, I guess. So Greg has forwarded that on. If we believe The Hill, and there's probably no reason not to believe them on something like this. Trump's pitch to Maine lobstermen has fallen flat. They put it in the present tense, falls flat. Rebecca, what is this last name? Beach? What would you, this is a difficult and dangerous name to mispronounce. Beitsch. Now, what could that be? Biatch. It's like, what? Let's not get into that. Beach, I'm guessing? Wow. All right. Well, I certainly hope so. That's an interesting and alternative. We ought to popularize that as a pronunciation, as a colloquial street. A very very ethnic pronunciation I'm giving things. The whitest person we could find to do something like this. All right. Moving on. I think we should probably pay some attention to the substance of what she's written here instead. This is datelined Stonington, Maine. And by the way, not only did she write the article, she is credited with the photo of the lobster place. What are we calling this? It's not clear whether it's a restaurant or just a place where you can pick up fresh lobster, take it home, and make it yourself, or whether it's a rustic restaurant that will make it for you. Maybe you can check it out. Somebody go to Stonington and take a look for this building. Anyway, she snapped the photo herself, I'm sure, on a phone or something, and it's just actually kind of an interesting story all by itself, probably, just how much of news reporting is done this way these days. But here's the story. President Trump is struggling to win over Maine voters with his recent pledge to lift restrictions for the state's lobster industry. And, I mean, it probably was as good a guess as any that Trump is capable of making for how to win votes in Maine. But, again, it's sort of a childlike approach to everything. Maine, tell me a state where we need to do some work to shore up our voters. Well, sir, he came to me, tears streaming down his eyes, and said, Maine, I'm crying because I love Maine so much, is one of these states that we really need to do some work in. And Trump says, Maine, easy, lobster. We'll just untax lobster or something else. And then as it turns out, Maine, while they surely love their lobster, and there are more people working in the lobster industry than in Maine than say in Arizona, right? It's not necessarily all they do there, and obviously it's not been that successful. Plus, I guess he couldn't hit on a formula that was really helpful for them. Trump was beaming when he traveled to the state just 2 months ago to tell lobstermen, this is a specific purpose of his trip, to tell lobstermen he was reversing protections for some 5,000 miles of ocean territory in a bid to open it to fishing. Aha. You're going to go fishing in that area now that you haven't seen for a long time, Trump said at a roundtable with representatives from Maine's fishing industry. Lobstermen and seafood producers, I just want to congratulate you. Now, what they're being congratulated for, I guess, is having ears, such that they could hear the message he was delivering, that he was opening up more areas to fishing, which is, I don't know. I don't know what areas he's opening up, but it's not just that like the entire ocean is filled with lobster and every bit of it that you can open up to seafood extraction is going to be good for lobstermen. I mean, they kind of have their own. Well, first of all, as I recall, the traditional methodologies here for the lobstermen, the Maine lobstermen, they kind of have their own territory, more or less. But all right, I mean, if they're opening up marine preserves in places that are just not traditionally good lobstering territory, then I don't know what that is going to do for you. But Trump's idea here may be ocean lobsters, so that's as close as it gets to being a coherent policy. Well, let's see what they actually thought of it. The state's lobstermen aren't celebrating, which is weird. That's because the area Trump aims to reopen is 130 miles southeast of Cape Cod. That's Massachusetts, of course, rather than Maine. Far beyond the reach of Maine's day boat lobstermen. I guess, again, Trump's idea in mind is, I saw, you know what I really like? The perfect storm. The storm was so perfect. It was perfect, very strongly perfect, like people have never seen before. And that's his idea of it. And they're multi-day trips for at least in this case, for the swordfish fishermen. And I don't know, they're sort of New England types, and they have a fishing boat, and that must be the same as lobster. So therefore, something. A totally different state. But it's near an ocean, which is full of lobsters. Apparently not. This doesn't help Maine fishermen at all. Leroy Weed, 79, interesting, who has had a lobster license since he was 10 years old, which is really something, said of Trump's reversal of protections for the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Marine National Monument off of Cape Cod. So what I'm finding here, the subtext of this is Donald Trump just sabotaged or vandalized a national monument. So I believe he's supposed to spend 10 years in jail for this. Under our new zero tolerance policy for doing damage to national monuments. But this national monument contains delicious seafood, allegedly, and so that's okay, I guess. We can tear up pieces of this national monument and eat it in butter. So it's the good kind. And Trump favors those, I think, very strongly favors things you can eat, really. Get the most attention from him, as far as I can tell. Well, anyway, I guess it doesn't really work out all that well. There's more to it. There isn't a boat in this harbor worth $2 million. I don't know exactly what he's saying here. This is Mr. Weed here. There isn't a boat in this harbor worth $2 million that could go out there and compete, Weed said, pointing out to Stonington's horseshoe-shaped cove, home of the state's most productive lobster port. Probably well known to all Mainers. When I said, oh, this is Dateline Stonington, they said, aha, Maine's most successful lobster port. Or productive, anyway, which equals successful, I'm sure, in Donald Trump's mind. But what is he saying here? Isn't a boat in this harbor worth $2 million that could go out there and compete? I don't know whether he's speaking to the specifics of some other policy. Is there some sort of $2 million threshold that maybe taxation has something to do? I don't know. Can't tell. In other words, what I'm telling you here is he's speaking to the specifics of some policy. We can't tell what policy it is. That's largely Donald Trump's fault, I'm sure, for not articulating the policy. But Leroy Weed hasn't helped us, in other words, get from here to there, which means, of course, that you can't get there from here, and that's very traditionally New England, and so we enjoy that part of it and say, we have had a homespun yarn, a hoary experience, the H-O-A-R kind of hoary experience, and we're all just so much the better for it. It's been a very nice visit to New England. Thank you very much for this story from the Hill. Oh, there's more. Most of Maine's lobstering, did you know this, takes place within, this is what I thought, 3 miles of shore, you see. And even those with a federal license don't typically travel more than 30 miles offshore. Trump's pronouncement in June marked his latest overture to an industry that has been hit hard by tariffs in his trade war with China. But again, recall that Trump thinks that that has been a tremendous success and that China is paying all those tariffs, so he's not going to accept the criticism that this doesn't help it doesn't help the lobstering industry at all. And why he thinks they need help, I'm not really sure. With China paying so much money, why doesn't he just give them the money instead of telling them, I'm going to open a fishery that is 150 miles past any place you've ever gone to go lobstering? But, too much detail for that. By the way, when was this article from? Pardon me. This is, it's dated, August 6th, 2020. But you know how when you're reading an article and there's sidebar, pieces, related news, etc. The related news being, well, you know what? It's not news. It's presented under the banner of related news, but it's outside advertising links. But one of the links is to a story that the headline begins, it's abbreviated. Here we go. If I scroll over, it gives me the whole headline. Herman Cain undergoing oxygen treatment in hospital after coronavirus diagnosis, which was true at some point. But if it's true now, it seems like an awful waste. Now, Herman Cain, now at this point, is literally a waste of oxygen. He's dead. There's very little benefit, I think, from oxygen therapy of any kind for him now. I mean, oxygen is your enemy at this point. You need to get to the embalmers. All right. I think they could use a little updating. But again, I was worried, like, is The Hill running this as a story? Now I'm actually curious. This clickbait might work. But I see that it's one of the outside vendors instead. Okay. Where were we? Most of the lobstering takes place about 1 million miles away from the place that Trump was removing from federal protection, the national monument he was defacing. Trump's pronouncement in June marked his latest overture to an industry that has been hit hard by tariffs in his trade war with China. As November nears and as polls show presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden with a double-digit lead over Trump in Maine, Trump has floated a number of proposals, including financial aid for the lobster industry, which he didn't discuss, I guess, to undo what he says was damage done by former President Obama. As you know, Obama, huge lobster hater, banned lobster worldwide, I guess. But Maine lobster hauls steadily increased during the Obama administration, because so many things did. It was the healthcare program for lobsters that really did it, if you ask me. The real turmoil for the industry came in 2018, which was, of course, during the Trump administration, when the Chinese market vanished under a 35% tariff on lobster. Tom Adams, a lobster wholesaler who founded Maine Coast, whatever that is, recalled when he first heard about the tariffs. I recall that I first heard about those tariffs back in 2018. I read that news, and when my wife got home later that evening, I told her about the tariffs and how it could potentially impact the Maine coast, this time not capitalizing the C. So apparently Maine Coast is some sort of organization that he founded. This Maine coast that he's speaking of now is the actual coastline of Maine and the immediate environs. I told her about how the tariffs and how it could potentially impact the Maine coast and our family, and I spent a weekend kind of feeling bad for myself, Adams told The Hill. What a tremendous comment that is. Is this him with the lobster? The caption doesn't identify him in this next picture. After the tariffs hit, Maine lobster trade with China dropped 48%. And you got to wonder how much Maine lobster, I mean, you got to ship those fresh all the way to China. I mean, it can be done. I suppose you just put them on a plane with some ice, I guess. I'm sure I'm understating the logistics of it. And I'm sure that there is a market there for it, but I don't know. I'm curious about how big it was. See whether it's cited in the article here. Adams was heavily invested in China at the time. His sales there dropped 80%. And he said his company worked hard to find new markets so their sales wouldn't plummet, a challenge he still faces today. It's remained a struggle in that sense to get ourselves sorted, he said. I'm certain that, well, this might be one of those, again, hoary Maine colloquialisms, or it might just be an older guy that doesn't make a great deal of sense. But you can see maybe why Trump thought he might score some points with this guy. Neither of us really have it entirely together to express ourselves, but one of us is the president of the United States, and the job is chiefly, even as Trump views it, chiefly a communications job, whereas my job is to go out in the water and pull lobsters out of it and mail them to wherever the hell they're supposed to go. And I can pretty much get the job done, even if I'm not the most eloquent speaker in the world. Shortly after Trump's June visit, the White House announced it would offer lobstermen the same type of aid the Department of Agriculture gave to Midwest farmers as the Chinese markets for corn, soybean, and pork collapsed during the trade war. You know that the Chinese addressed the pork part of the trade war by buying up American pork producers and then just saying, well, we're just going to ship ourselves from our American subsidiaries all the pork that we need, and there'll be no tariffs involved because we're a, quote, American company. So I guess they didn't have enough interest in buying up American lobster production to do the same. But I guess they could. But Trump offers them the same sort of aid that the USDA gave to the Midwest farmers, and presumably in some cases Midwest farmers' daughters as well, also following their father's footsteps into the business. Good advice. Don't plant the lobsters too close together. Maybe that would work. It's not clear who would get the aid in the lobster case or when it will arrive. I would say probably 2 weeks. Neither I nor my staff have received an update on USDA's plans to provide direct relief to the lobster industry. Senator Angus King, himself a lobster, wrote to Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue last month, asking the agency to reach out to both the Maine delegation and industry leaders. Where's our money? Representative Chelly Pingree, also of Maine, of course, and I think probably at least half lobster, whose district includes the state's most active lobster territory. I would assume, yeah. The inland part of it is much less active in terms of lobster territory. Criticized Trump's visit, saying his promise of aid to offset tariffs was coming too late. There are issues that have been problematic for quite a while, she said. I'm sure in his mind appealing to the lobstermen was, showing concern for working people in an important industry in our state. But I don't think it's a positive thing to do if you're just making empty promises, particularly for an industry that has a lot of reasons to be worried. True. Seems like a sensible statement. One of the reasons is COVID-19, which hadn't come into play so far in the story. Some of the largest markets for lobster, cruise ships and restaurants, good point here, have shut down because of the outbreak. Yeah, I mean, people do eat lobster at home, that's true, but yeah, generally that's something you would go out for. Yeah, fairly obvious point. And just I'm glad that in my opinion, we've saved the article here just by bringing that up. At this time, when the lobster industry is struggling and the domestic market remains paralyzed by COVID, it would be helpful to have a thriving international market where people are healthy, right? Said Genevieve McDonald, the Democratic state representative from Stonington, and herself a lobster boat captain. How do you like that? That's pretty cool. Interesting names in this tier, too. I was thinking of Sonny Perdue as USDA secretary and just sort of thinking Perdue, chicken, does he want to save the lobster industry? I don't know if he comes from that family or not, but would make a significant, make some sense, right? And he ends up at the head of the USDA. Genevieve McDonald, probably no relationship to Ronald McDonald, but I do note for the record that when I last visited Maine, like 1993, I was interested to find that there were lobster rolls on the McDonald's menu. And I'm sure that half of Maine just vomited thinking about that. But it's true. And they had a whole thing. It was the Down East meal that they called it. It's a lobster roll. And they have, how they have those hot apple pies. And occasionally they fill them with pumpkin goop around October and during the pumpkin spice craze. Is COVID-19 going to interrupt our pumpkin spice supply? That's a serious thing that nobody has given any thought to yet. Anyway, they had a blueberry one, and it was a very exciting prospect. I don't believe I actually ordered one, although I may have grabbed the blueberry pie separately. But I just thought it was an interesting. I think I took a picture of the McDonald's menu, and I probably never bothered to display that picture anywhere. That was a real waste of, and probably actual film at the time, too. Anyway, this has nothing to do with anything. Neither does the rest of this article, really, but it's quite fun. And I feel like in Greg's absence, we're having a good time with this one. Trump's main solution for the industry has been more fishing. I mean, I guess so, right? We're not making any money fishing. Why don't you do more fishing? All right. I mean, there's problems with that, but so far so good. What else have we got to say? Also, well, let's see. The solution has been more fishing, arguing that marine protections, not tariffs, have reduced lobstermen's income, except they don't fish in those marine protected areas, and probably never did. The president has argued that lobstermen's income was reduced not by tariffs, but by Obama's designation of the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Marine National Monument off Cape Cod. They took away your livelihood. It's ridiculous, he said, while reversing the protections. However, the Obama-era restrictions on lobstering in the area aren't slated to take effect until 2023. So, whatever. I mean, so again, Trump read something somewhere about, didn't Obama do something that they said was going to hurt the lobster trade in Maine? Yeah, but it goes into effect in 2023. Well, I'm sure that went in one ear and out the other. And even so, even if it didn't, that wouldn't stop him. I mean, how many times has he claimed to be the signer of the Veterans Choice Act when that was Obama? So this won't sink in with him either, I'm sure. All right. Coming up against our break here, but maybe the music can take us out of this article at long last. The price lobstermen are paid for their catch has dropped under the tariffs, but the bigger fear for the industry is that prices this season might drop to levels that prevent fishermen from keeping up with payments on boats and equipment. Lobstermen argue that if Trump wanted to help the industry, he would have focused on loosening protections for the North Atlantic right whale that restrict the amount of line used for lobster traps in order to reduce deadly entanglements. That topic was discussed during Trump's visit, but only briefly, in favor instead of one that has nothing whatsoever to do with the industry. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Here on Lobster Radio, you'd think that it was all lobsters all the time, and it might as well be. You know, there's actually more to this article. They do a good job in packing a lot into this article that we would otherwise not have noticed, but thanks to Greg's eagle eye, we've spent, like a half an hour on this thing. But it's actually, there's some more stuff of interest. That's the official terminology for it here. Oh, wait a second. I've just seen another article go by that I want to grab for our attention. Just put that aside. But here's what made me think I had to come back to it. You remember that there's the North Atlantic right whale that was endangered by allegedly by the long lines used by, or at least the longer of the lines used on lobster traps that entangle the right whale. And he made a solid pledge of support to the lobstermen and lobster women who were there at the event. The topic, as they said, did come up during his visit, but only briefly because he doesn't know anything about it. And I think you get the sense that the people who brought it up knew that it was something that he would know nothing about and it would largely bore him. But here we have Kristen Porter, president of the Maine Lobstermen's Association, at the round table, saying, "I just want to, as a lobsterman, bring up something that I would be run out of town if I didn't bring up to you. And it's this: we find our industry at risk of being shut down because of the endangered right whale." Okay. So, you can just picture Trump going, staring blankly like, yeah, okay. So Trump pledged to consider easing the regulations so long as they could still protect the whales. which, that's a nice thing. I mean, I guess, right? That's actually sort of like an almost responsible position to take, except that it's kind of pandering, probably. But, I mean, if you know nothing about it, that's a traditional politician's escape from things. Well, I would consider taking a look. You know how he says about that. We'll take a look at the regulations. But it was interesting that he notes, but as long as we can continue to protect the whale, because that's a laudable goal. I would have expected him to say, screw these whales, shred them for mulch. I don't care. Just as long as my good friends, the lobstermen, get to do whatever it is they want to do. That's the person I'm pandering to here. But I guess that I don't know, maybe he had the sense that the lobstermen were thinking, look, we want to be able to be free to get to maximize our catch. We don't want to slaughter right whales. It's an unfortunate thing, and we think we have ways of doing things relatively safely, such that we won't endanger the right whale. Or for all I know, the lobster fishermen say, "Screw right whales. What do they do for anybody?" I don't know, but it was interesting that Trump's instinct was to say, "Well, as long as we can still protect the whales." But then it's not clear if he knows anything about the whales themselves or cares, or maybe he's just generically, people say save the whales. He's stuck in the 80s and mentally, and that probably sticks with him. I remember all the models that I liked so much in the 80s and 90s were very concerned about saving the whales. So we should save those. But check this out. There's more to it here, right? Trump pledged to consider easing the regulations. We'll take a look at it very strongly, so long as they could still protect the whales, which he at one point referred to as the white whale, which, again, I mean, it's right, R-I-G-H-T, whale. He refers to it as the white whale because he's very old and hard of hearing and very unhealthy and a dotard, and doesn't know that there is such a thing called the right whale. And not everybody knows anything about them. And he heard white whale, and I'm sure he thought, well, I'm sure he thinks he's a white whale supremacist. Those are the best whales, the white ones. And of course, isn't that the one from Moby Dick? That's historic because Moby Dick, which was a documentary, obviously, and so there's some historic importance to this white whale. It was very important that Ahab, who was had a terrible environmental record, not at all like Trump, who's a very big friend of the environment. If you take a look at all the buildings I've put together and built around the world, very environmentally conscious of everything. It's a huge burden on me. I spent a lot of money on it. Believe me, I could have made a lot more money on these buildings, but I took care of the environment. Like Ahab, unlike Ahab, who wanted very badly to kill this white whale, we are going to preserve the white whale, but also you're going to make a bundle with your lobster. So, okay, no announcements, by the way, have been made by the administration since then, despite probably promising them in 2 weeks. While Trump has his critics in Maine, some said his visit may prove worthwhile come Election Day. He did come here and talk about lobster in a hangar at the international airport. Now, which international airport? Bangor. So that has the ring of a Muhammad Ali line there a little bit. He did come here and talk about lobster in a hangar in Bangor International Airport. I don't think that occurred to Genevieve McDonald, but that's who said it. He did raise some awareness about our plight. There are roughly 5,000 lobster licenses in Maine, and the industry supports at least another 10,000 jobs in the state. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton beat Trump in Maine by about 22,000 votes in 2016, so twice the size of the lobster industry. Oh, well, I guess 5,000 lobster licenses plus 10,000 additional jobs is 15,000, so as a 7,000 vote margin on top of the entirety of the lobster industry. There's something romantic about fishing and farming for a living that the general public seems to support, Adams said. Remember Adams? So I do think it can sway votes. Showing support for fishermen and their families and all the supply that can go along with that, yeah, I think that can have a big impact in Maine. Well, we'll see. But the headline says it flopped. So if it has a big impact, it's not likely to be a positive one. How interesting. But there really wasn't a great deal that he could have screwed up in this. And yet he did screw it all up. He talked to them about undoing a marine preserve that has nothing to do with where they fish, and got the name of the whale wrong, and promised them something that he has no intention whatsoever of following up on. Okay. So, let's see. Lots of other news here, and we'll have to catch up on some of these. I'll mark some of these things for Pocket on the standby computer, and then go back to monitoring our Twitter feed so that we don't miss any of the real fun stuff. But yeah, let's move on from Maine. As much fun as it's been. Thank you, Bill, for hosting us there. And hi to Michael and the squirrels as well. So I hope you're all doing well, and I hope you don't mind if we don't do the rest of the show about Maine. But there's a whole wide world out there to cover, and we're going to get to about 0.07% of it. Oh, speaking of percentages, that gives me another idea. We heard, of course, President Trump in his interview with Axios the other day, arguing with Jonathan Swan about the metrics by which the United States response to the coronavirus, if there indeed has been one, should be measured. And you recall, of course, I guess the most outrageous exchange discussed early this week was the one in which they're swapping papers back and forth, and Trump is attempting to convince Swan that our death rate is world-beating on coronavirus. And Swan is confused because, of course, but by the most widely used measure of death rate, which is what percentage of your population has died from COVID-19, because that's the normalizing value here. You can look at the raw numbers of cases or the raw numbers of deaths, but obviously countries that have larger populations would likely have larger numbers of deaths. So the raw numbers don't tell you very much. So they normalize it by reporting it, in the case of worldometers, which we use, as deaths per million or cases per million. And as deaths per million go, the United States ranks about 10th in the world. That is to say, the 10th worst, with a death rate of 488 currently, 488 people per 1 million in population. So for every one of the 331 million people in this country, for every million, 488 of them have died from COVID. That's not the worst in the world. San Marino still holds that title because it's a statistical anomaly, a microstate with only a population of just under 34,000. But this, believe it or not, becomes relevant. The way Trump figures things and the way Trump would have or wanted Swan to view our death rate was how many people have died from among the pool of people diagnosed with COVID-19, which doesn't, it's not a bizarre concept. That would be one we've gone to in the past as what I've described as our observed mortality rate. Because in the early days, in particular, of the pandemic, we were worried about trying to figure out, well, how deadly is COVID-19? What's the mortality rate? And there was arguments that ultimately we would find that it really was only killing about half of 1% of the people who contracted it, and so therefore no problem. But then, of course, when you started to run the numbers and you realize, well, how many people are there in the world who could catch this thing? Well, it's a novel coronavirus. We have no immunity to it. Everyone in the world could catch this thing. And if you killed a half of 1% of everyone in the world, why, that would be many, many millions of people. Or even just here in the United States, that would be several million people. I think what we decided was something in the neighborhood of, well, we could run the math. But that math doesn't matter. We'll get to the other math. The point was that Trump had set up this weird metric, which, it's of some interest. How are you doing vis-a-vis other countries in terms of treating those who come down with COVID-19? And you would expect to see places with good medical systems, great healthcare systems, wherever you would rank ours, doing better than, say, places with impoverished nations where there was just no access to medical care. But as it turns out, a lot of times those nations weren't hotspots for COVID-19 because there wasn't a lot of international travel to them or from them among the class of carriers who had brought it back from, say, the ski resorts of Europe when our first hotspots started popping up around the world. Anyway, it's of some interest, like I said, of how many people who catch it actually die. But most people were normalizing across entire populations. And Jonathan Swan was kind of shocked and surprised to find that Trump was using this other measure. Well, I was just taking a look at just, how inappropriate really is it to use in terms of comparing yourselves to other nations when, for the purpose of discussing how are you doing generally in the pandemic. And it occurs to me that I guess the reason that his staff handed him that metric must be because, well, think about the mathematics of it, right? Normally you think about who has the most cases in the world. And you know that United States has got by far the most cases of anybody. We're nearing and may, I would venture to guess, pass, according to Worldometers, our 5 millionth case sometime today. The next nearest competitor, if you want to think about it that way, is Brazil with 2.8 million cases and India with 1.9 million. And it's just 3 countries in the world with more than 1 million reported cases. And we've got 5 million. So what that means, of course, mathematically is we have this gigantic denominator in this formula. If your formula for determining how a country is doing with coronavirus is how many total deaths have they had divided by how many total cases have they had, we're going to come out okay on that kind of scale because our denominator is gigantic and twice the size of anyone else in the world, and dwarfing the vast majority of the world. So what that should make obvious mathematically is what you're looking for, what the places that Trump's description of how you're doing with coronavirus would peg as the worst in the world would be places with almost, no real population to speak of, the statistical anomalies and the microstates of the world who have had a rough time of things and had a significant number of deaths by that percentage, but overall just really haven't had much exposure to the coronavirus. And a case in point here, for instance, our observed mortality rate has dropped considerably. For a while, we were heading up to the high end of the 5% range, nearing 6%, but it has come down considerably and is now in the neighborhood of about 3.25%. We have now 161,660 deaths, again, according to Worldometers, and 4,975,279 total cases. Comes out to about 3.25%. So, how does that compare to the others in the world? And among other leading countries, it does change the standings a little bit. Brazil outpacing us a little bit by about with about a 3.4% mortality rate from this. India with just over 2%, doing, I guess, a little bit better. But let's say immediately to the south in Mexico, where any number of factors might be playing into this, they've seen about 10.8% of the people infected with COVID-19 ultimately die. But Mexico is still looking at less than 500,000 cases. So who's doing better? Mexico with 500,000 cases or United States with 5 million cases? 10 times more cases, but only a 3.25% death rate. Maybe the point could be illustrated a little more finely when you look way down at the extremes at the other end, and you get to see just how dumb is it to use observed mortality rate for as the only key metric for something like this. And I looked down at the other end of the list. Where do they have very little in terms of exposure to coronavirus? And one of the units reported on at Worldometers is the British Virgin Islands. Seem to make a very clear case of the British Virgin Islands has, according to Trump's metric, an 11% death rate, greater even than Mexico. They've been devastated by the virus, right? Trump's statistic makes no sense here, right? The U.S. has a 3.25% death rate. British Virgin Islands, 11% death rate. Who's doing worse? Asks President Trump. The chart, I'm sure they didn't use the British Virgin Islands on the chart, but if they had, it would have looked like, wow, the British Virgin Islands is 3 times worse off than the United States by death rate. Well, the U.S., as we said, is nearing 5 million cases, has over 161,000 at this moment dead. British Virgin Islands, 9 total cases and 1 death. You tell me what the average person, go and ask one, would say about who's doing worse in this situation. The British Virgin Islands here, let's see, by population, like, when we divide things by 1 million population, that's why we use that normalizing version of the statistic. By 1 million in population, the United States has 14,920 cases per million and 486 deaths per million. British Virgin Islands, put them on the same scale, 298 cases versus our 14,920 and 33 deaths versus our 486 per million. But Trump would say that the U.S. death rate is 3.25%, where the British Virgin Islands death rate is 11%. And so therefore we're doing much, much better than the British Virgin Islands. That's why his chart was so dumb. And that's why Jonathan Swan looked like he was smelling farts the whole time he was conducting this interview. He could not believe what was going on. And that's basically it. That's what makes the situation so ridiculous, and why the rest of the media spent the balance of the week writing stories that essentially, look, we're just never going to get out from under this while Trump has any authority. That's what I've said the whole time, and I guess everybody else probably has been saying it all along too, but they're just getting around in some cases to writing those pieces. But, here we are, stuck with him, and apparently unable to get out from underneath it. Now, one of the reasons we may be unable to get out from underneath it, there are a couple of approaches here to this one. Let's start with the small bore, but very important reason why we won't get out from underneath it. Our media infrastructure, and our social media infrastructure in particular. Here's a disconcerting bit of news. I've got a couple of tweets that picked up on this one, but this summarizes several such cases, and we'll take a look at Parker Malloy's tweet here. The Media Matters editor-at-large, who tweets that Twitter is now locking the accounts of people fact-checking Trump. This is very interesting. Aaron Rupar, whose name we call very frequently on the show because he's big on disseminating a lot of the look how stupid Trump is videos, and we appreciate him for it, doing this work on behalf of Vox, reports that he's had his account, or at least had recently had his account locked by Twitter support. And he's tweeting out his complaint here saying, "This is absolutely nuts. Twitter support. My account was locked for quoting and fact-checking Trump. And I was forced to delete this tweet." He includes a screenshot of it. "Why am I getting punished for shining a light on the president's falsehoods?" Here's what went on here. The tweet in question is Aaron saying, holy crap. You know what he said. Trump says, quote, "My view of the schools," we heard this the other day, "my view of the schools is the schools should open. This thing is going away. It will go away like things go away." Which, by the way, just cognitively, such a beautiful encapsulation of everything. How will it go away? It'll go away like things go away, by going away. What does that mean? I don't know. It doesn't matter. "My view is the school should open. This thing is going away. It will go away like things go away. And my view is that schools should be open." He falsely claims kids are, quote, "almost immune from COVID." Just stunningly irresponsible stuff. He's absolutely right. He includes a link, I guess, to the source where he came up with this quote. It is crazy. The news is that Twitter suspended the Trump campaign for disseminating that very quote, particularly the part about kids being, quote, "almost immune," unquote, from COVID. Same result at Facebook. The Trump campaign, an important entity in an election year, suspended from major social media platforms for it. Now here, Aaron Rupar is saying, "Look at this dumb thing Trump said. Can you believe it? It's disinformation about COVID. He should be suspended from Twitter according to Twitter's rules." What does Twitter do with it? And they got rid of Trump's campaign Twitter account, but they, of course, don't dare threaten Trump's Twitter account, although maybe he didn't disseminate that news, that non-news, that fake news, that garbage over his own Twitter account, and that would be wise of him to have avoided doing. But for Aaron Rupar to say, "Look at this dumb disinformation," and then, obviously this was done by algorithm. They just searched everything, and what they have here is the computers over at Twitter told them that Aaron Rupar tweeted the words, "Kids are almost immune from COVID," and they suspended his account and forced him to delete the tweet, which actually did the job of their own fact-checking better than they did it, because they did it by algorithm and not in person. And they sent them the standard note that you get. "What happened? We have determined that this account violated the Twitter rules, specifically for 1, violating the policy on spreading misleading and potentially harmful information related to COVID-19. We understand that during times of crisis and instability, it is difficult to know what to do to keep yourself and loved ones safe. Under this policy, we require the removal of content that may pose a risk to people's health, including content that goes directly against guidance from authoritative sources of global and local public health information. For more information on COVID-19, as well as guidance from leading global health authorities, please refer to the following links." They got some links there. Then they display his own tweet back to him. But of course, the whole point of the tweet was, don't listen to this crazy, stupid, misleading, and potentially harmful information disseminated by Donald Trump. It's doing its job here, doing Twitter's job for them, and yet they are blocking him for doing it. Let's see. We also have here from Parker Malloy. She collects Bobby Lewis's tweet. "For the third time," he says, "in less than 12 hours, Twitter locked my account for coronavirus misinformation from Fox and Friends." This tweet was from this morning's show, in which Bobby Lewis says, "Fox and Friends defends Trump for calling children almost immune to coronavirus," which is not true. "All those great doctors in Silicon Valley will decide what is right and what is wrong. So much for Mark Zuckerberg saying he wouldn't be the arbiter of truth." And what do? They lock the account of the person who says Donald Trump is responsible for disseminating misinformation. I don't know what they're going to do. I don't understand. How is Twitter going to communicate to people that they're locking Trump's account without repeating the misinformation? I guess they'll just say, "We locked Trump's campaign account for a reason. We don't have to tell you what it is." There's another one here. Parker sends us another from the recount. Yup, we got it too. Had to remove this to access our account. The tweet in question. Trump pushes the claim that children are almost immune. Basically, they just did this by algorithm. Anybody who tweeted about the fact that Trump lied about kids being immune to COVID got the treatment, whereas only one of the Trump umbrella organizations, entities, got the same treatment. And no one's even talking about that one. Let's see. Parker goes on here to say Twitter has previously said that reports about COVID-19 will still be reviewed manually. That's according to Twitter's own blog, but apparently that just cannot possibly be the case. Parker goes on to say, I swear I'm just going to start blocking the people replying with this crap in this thread. Oh, yeah, the helpful, earnest Twitter folks who say, well, when you retweet propaganda, you're spreading it. Don't do that. I mean, that's good advice for staying off of Twitter's radar, but it's not necessarily actually good advice for reporters who are fact-checking politicians. Parker says, actually, I've written about this topic several times over. I don't need people replying with condescending nonsense about screenshot, don't quote. Yeah, that is kind of annoying, but I get that all the time. We could, maybe I'll pull up and take a look at this and review Parker's writing directly on that subject. But in the meantime, of course, time for our 1 minute top of the hour break, except for the fact that, all right, there we are. The music was turned all the way down, and now it's turned all the way up. Way too loud. Okay. The things we have to deal with in the technical side of the show that we sometimes forget. Okay. Well, let's see. I think there's one or two more examples of this, but I think basically they're all having the same difficulty retweeting the shocking news about Trump saying that kids are almost immune. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro Show, Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I let the music go on too long because I was staring at yet another crazy bit of information going by, and I came back in late and I said, I'll abbreviate the re-entry by just saying the Kagro Show, and then I said, that doesn't sound right. Distracted here by, all right, well, we'll display it here. I just retweeted it for those of you who are listening live. You can see it, and I'll mark it for inclusion in the record. It's like a court case here. Kara Jackson tweeting the very good question, what in the y-axis is going on here? Retweeting the screenshot taken and distributed by Professor Anne-Marie Carlton, an atmospheric chemist. Is Anne-Marie Carlton, who takes this shot and says, oh, Florida, seriously. It is a screenshot, or I guess a picture she took with her phone of it must have been going on TV here. This ought to qualify for getting your account locked, although we don't want it to happen to all the people who reported that it happened. Coronavirus, Florida confirmed cases. And it's one of those nice, simple, big, wide, colorful bar charts like the ones they gave to the president. And I guess you can see, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how something like this happens or why in this particular case this would happen, but it does. And people who are this dumb, I guess, work for the president and give him his information. Florida confirmed cases. And it's a simple bar chart, for whatever reason, of reports from 6/17, that would be June 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st. And quite honestly, that's 5 days. It doesn't tell you hardly anything. And most of the places I've seen information like that displayed, they do a 7-day rolling average. This is 5 days, not average, but just how many confirmed cases verified on those 5 days. And the numbers are thus: 3,207 on the 17th, 3,822 on the 18th, 4,049 on the 19th, 3,494 on the 20th, and then 2,926 on June 21st. So what you have here is, some increase going on from the 17th through the 19th, and then decreases from the 19th through the 21st. So, I guess the source here is the Florida Department of Health. Though it's unclear whether the source is simply the source of the raw data or whether the source of the chart. And I can't decide which one I think it is. Now, I would think that the Florida Department of Health would be very interested in showing an overall decline. And, they're being honest, they're saying that there was an increase for the first 3 days. There's a considerable decline from the peak of, if this was their peak, at least the peak of this period on 6/19. So you would think that if they're going to screw with the size of the bars, the y-axis of this chart, you would do so in a way. You don't have to do anything to demonstrate a decline. But if you really wanted to fake something up and demonstrate a consistent decline, you would fake it up such that the numbers for 6/17 are high and then down, 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 down. Instead, what they have here is a bar chart that shows, according to the size of the bars, a peak on the first day, and then a trough, and then a rise again. So somebody who was looking at the chart, not paying attention to the numbers, would say, wow, Florida was experiencing a decrease in the number of confirmed cases, but has since spiked again. So it doesn't even serve propaganda purposes. Worse still, of course, is that on this chart, the highest bar there is on this y-axis is the first day, 6/17, 3,207 cases. The 18th, on which they report 3,822 cases, an increase of, what are we looking at? About 600, increase of 600 cases. The bar is smaller and is about a third of the size of the first bar. Now, the next day, there is a bar about a quarter of the size of this smaller bar, representing 4,049 cases, an increase of 800 cases over the first day. And it's the smallest bar on the chart and looks like a trough. Then, of course, on the 20th, that bar doubles in size to represent 3,494 cases, which is actually a decrease of about 500. And then a bar 4 times that size, representing the decrease to 2,926 cases. I mean, it's like it was prepared by somebody who was asked to make a bar chart and looked up in the dictionary, bar chart, what is that? And then saw a picture of a bar graph, like a bar graph, and said, all right. Or maybe went into, I don't know, a data, like Excel or something, or whatever you would use, or PowerPoint to make charts like that, and took a chart template. I needed something with 5 bars on it. That's how many days worth of data I have. Take that chart and then just Photoshop these numbers over these bars without, regard for how large the bars should be. It's quite troubling. These are the people who are supposed to get us out of the pandemic, you see. That's the worrisome part. And that's why I think we may never get out of this thing. We might have some difficulty undoing this problem. There are several other sources for similar takes. We'll turn here to the New York Times, which, as I understand it, is a very large circulation and important newspaper in the United States, even though there are many people who hate it. But I was pointed to this one on Twitter. Somebody said it was a worth our time. David Leonhardt, whose name we have called a couple times on the program before, with the headline, "The Unique U.S. Failure to Control the Virus," because it does appear that that's what we've got going on here. Slowing the coronavirus, the subheader reads, has been especially difficult for the United States because of its tradition of prioritizing individualism and missteps by the Trump administration. That seems to kind of sum it up nicely, but then he needs to provide several hundred more words in order to satisfy his editors, and he does it this way. Nearly every country has struggled to contain the coronavirus and made mistakes along the way. China committed the first major failure. Oh, that's like a good sop to Trump and Trump supporters. Silencing doctors who tried to raise alarms about the virus, although we do all remember that that was reported to be the case, and allowing it to escape from Wuhan. That's going to be the name of a movie at some point. Much of Europe went next, failing to avoid enormous outbreaks. Today, many countries, Japan, Canada, France, Australia, and more, are coping with new increases in cases after reopening parts of society. Yet, even with all these problems, one country stands alone as the only affluent nation to have suffered a severe, sustained outbreak for more than 4 months. And the answer, of course, to that is it's the United States. Over the past month, some graphics included here. This one showing like a big petri dish looking sort of thing here representing the U.S. Over the past month, about 1.9 million Americans have tested positive for the virus. That's more than 5 times as many in all of Europe, Canada, Japan, South Korea, and Australia combined. That's not good, right? Even though some of these countries saw worrying new outbreaks over the past month, that's what Trump was trying to harp on with Jonathan Swan, including 50,000 new cases in Spain, the outbreaks still pale in comparison to those in the United States. Florida, with a population of less than half that of Spain, has reported nearly 300,000 cases in the same period. When it comes to the virus, the United States has come to resemble not the wealthy and powerful countries to which it is often compared, but instead to far poorer countries. Countries that Donald Trump frequently refers to as, the crap, right? S-hole countries, which actually sounds a lot dumber than just saying the word out loud. And I think that, we'll just roll past it this time. But the rest of the broadcast industry got to say the same thing, too, so I shouldn't feel bad about it. Anyway, just a reminder that he dismissed the rest of the world that way, and now we find ourselves among their number in terms of response to the virus. So he's talking about far poorer countries like Brazil, Peru, and South Africa, or those with large migrant populations like Bahrain and Oman. As in several of those other countries, the toll of the virus in the United States has fallen disproportionately on poorer people and groups that have long suffered discrimination. Black and Latino residents of the United States have contracted the virus at roughly 3 times as high a rate as that of white residents. How did this happen? The New York Times set out to reconstruct the unique failure of the United States through numerous interviews with scientists and public health experts around the world. The reporting points to 2 central themes. Let's see if we can't make sure everything else, all the rest of our information is flowing while we get to those 2 themes. First, the United States faced long-standing challenges in confronting a major pandemic. It is a large country at the nexus of the global economy, with a tradition of prioritizing individualism over government restrictions. That tradition is one reason the United States suffers from an unequal healthcare system that has long produced worse medical outcomes, including higher infant mortality and diabetes rates and lower life expectancy than in most other rich countries. So one interesting base problem to start with here. As an American, I think there's a lot of good to be said about our libertarian tradition. Dr. Jared Baton, an epidemiologist and vice dean at the, ready for a long title, University of Washington School of Public Health, that's not too bad, said, but this is the consequence. We don't succeed as well as a collective. And that's, of course, the whole point of actually having a national identity is to succeed as a collective. But hey, why bother with that? The second major theme is one that public health experts often find uncomfortable to discuss because many try to steer clear of partisan politics. But many agree that the poor results in the United States stem from, in substantial measure, from the performance of the Trump administration. Well, you should be able to look at the leadership and see how'd you do. In no other high-income country, and in only a few countries, period, have political leaders departed from expert advice as frequently and significantly as the Trump administration. President Trump has said the virus was not serious, predicted it would disappear. He just did it again yesterday. Spent weeks questioning the need for masks, encouraged states to reopen even with large and growing caseloads, and promoted medical disinformation. In recent days, Mr. Trump has continued the theme, offering a torrent of misleading statistics in his public appearances that make the situation sound less dire than it is. And by the way, who's been getting punished for that? The people pointing out how wrong it is. How odd is that? Some Republican governors have followed his lead and also played down the virus, while others have largely followed the science. Democratic governors have more reliably heeded scientific advice, but their performance in containing the virus has been uneven. In many of the countries that have been very successful, they have had a much crisper strategic direction and really had a vision, said Caitlin Rivers, an epidemiologist at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, who wrote a guide to reopening safely for the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative research group. I'm not sure we ever really had a plan or strategy, or at least it wasn't public. And maybe we can get to some of that later on, too. Together, the national skepticism toward collective action and the Trump administration's scattered response to the virus have contributed to several specific failures and missed opportunities. Times reporting shows, and they bullet point them here for us, a lack of effective travel restrictions, which is, by the way, the first thing Trump goes to. I closed down travel from China, and we all know the problems with that one. But he thinks he's succeeded wildly on that one. Second bullet point here, repeated breakdowns in testing, confusing advice about masks, a misunderstanding of the relationship between the virus and the economy, and inconsistent messages from public officials. Already, the American death toll is of a different order of magnitude than in most other countries. With only 4% of the world's population, the United States has accounted for 22% of coronavirus deaths. Canada, a rich country that neighbors the United States, thank you for pointing that out. I mean, I'm glad you're rich, and that's true, but it does neighbor the United States. It has an international audience, the New York Times. But Canada has a per capita death rate about half as large, and these gaps may worsen in coming weeks given the lag between new cases and deaths. A chart helpfully illustrates the rest of it for everyone else here. Then on to more text. For many Americans who survive the virus or who do not contract it, the future will bring other problems. Many schools will struggle to open, and the normal activities of life, family visits, social gatherings, restaurant meals, sporting events, may be more difficult in the United States than in any other affluent country. In retrospect, one of Mr. Trump's first policy responses to the virus appears to have been one of his most promising. On January 31st, his administration announced that it was restricting entry to the United States from China. Many foreign nationals, be they citizens of China or other countries, would not be allowed into the United States if they had been to China in the previous 2 weeks. It was still early in the spread of the virus. The first cases in Wuhan, China, had been diagnosed about a month before, and the first announced case in the United States had come on January 21st. In announcing the new travel policy, Alex Azar, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, I didn't realize he was Alex M. Azar II, as a matter of fact, declared that the virus posed, quote, a public health emergency. Mr. Trump described the policy as his China ban. After the Trump administration acted, several other countries quickly announced their own restrictions on travel from China, including Japan, Vietnam, and Australia. But it quickly became clear that the United States' policy was full of holes through which the virus can get in very easily. You know, it's a small thing. It did not apply to immediate family members of American citizens and permanent residents returning from China, for example, which, you know, does the virus care whether it's in them or not? No. In the 2 months after the policy went into place, almost 40,000 people arrived in the United States on direct flights from China, not to mention those who routed through Canada or wherever and then came over. Even more important, the policy failed to take into account that the virus had spread well beyond China by early February. Later data would show that many infected people arriving in the United States came from Europe. The Trump administration did not restrict travel from Europe until March and exempted Britain from that ban despite a high infection rate there. Still among the worst in the world. But Trump exempted them probably for political purposes and insisted that it was because they were doing such a great job with the virus. They're actually doing worse than we are on a per capita basis. The administration's policy also did little to create quarantines for people who entered the United States and may have had the virus. Authorities in some other places took a far more rigorous approach to travel restrictions. South Korea, Hong Kong, and Taiwan largely restricted entry to residents returning home. Those residents then had to quarantine for 2 weeks upon arrival, with the government keeping close tabs to ensure they did not leave their home or hotel. South Korea and Hong Kong also tested for the virus at the airport and transferred anyone who was positive to a government facility. Australia offers a telling comparison. Like the United States, it is separated from China by an ocean and is run by a conservative leader, Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister. Unlike the United States, it put travel restrictions at the center of its virus response. Australian officials noticed in March that the travel restrictions they had announced on February 1st were not preventing the virus from spreading, so they went further. It's sort of scientific there, right? It's not working. Let's try something else. On March 27th, Mr. Morrison announced that Australia would no longer trust travelers to isolate themselves voluntarily. The country would instead mandate that everyone arriving from overseas, including Australian citizens, spend 2 weeks quarantined in a hotel. The protocols were strict. As people arrived at the airport, the authorities transported them directly to hotels nearby. People were not even allowed to leave their hotel to exercise. The Australian military helped enforce the rules. Around the same time, several Australian states with minor outbreaks shut their own borders to keep out Australians from regions with higher rates of infection. That hardening of internal boundaries had not happened since, you'll never guess, the 1918 flu pandemic, said Ian McKay, a virologist in Queensland, one of the first states to block entry from other areas. The United States, by comparison, imposed few travel restrictions, either for foreigners or American citizens. Individual states did little to enforce the rules they did impose. People need a bit more than a suggestion to look after their own health, said Dr. McKay, who has been working with Australian officials on their pandemic response. They need guidelines, they need rules, and they need to be enforced. Travel restrictions and quarantines were central to the success of controlling the virus in South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Australia, and New Zealand, many epidemiologists believe. In Australia, the number of new cases per day fell more than 90% in April. It remained near zero through May and early June, even as the virus surged across much of the United States. In the past 6 weeks, Australia has begun to have a resurgence, which itself points to the importance of the travel rules. The latest outbreak stems in large part from problems with the quarantine in the city of Melbourne. Compared with other parts of Australia, Melbourne relied more on private security contractors who employed temporary workers, some of whom lacked training and failed to follow guidelines to enforce quarantines at local hotels. Officials have responded by banning out-of-state travel again and imposing new lockdowns. Still, the tolls in Australia and the United States remain vastly different. Fewer than 300 Australians have died of complications of COVID-19. If the United States had the same per capita death rate, about 3,300 Americans would have died, rather than, at the time of this writing, 158,000. That seems like a lot less. So we're looking at a surplus of, now we're nearing about 158. So we're at about 158,000 surplus deaths over and above the 3,300 we would have otherwise seen, according to this model. Enacting tough travel restrictions in the United States would not have been easy. It is more integrated into the global economy than Australia is, has a tradition of local policy decisions and borders to other large countries. But there is a good chance that a different version of Mr. Trump's restrictions, one with fewer holes and stronger quarantines, would have meaningfully slowed the virus's spread. Traditionally, public health experts have not seen travel restrictions as central to fighting a pandemic, given their economic costs and the availability of other options like testing, quarantining, and contact tracing. Dr. Baton, the University of Washington epidemiologist, said, but he added that travel restrictions had been successful enough in fighting the coronavirus around the world that those views may need to be revisited. Travel, he said, is the hallmark of the spread of the virus around the world. The virus has no legs, right? How does it get around the world? On January 16th, now into the section on our testing failure. In fact, the double testing failure. On January 16th, nearly a week before the first announced case of the coronavirus in the United States, a German hospital made an announcement. Its researchers had developed a test for the virus, which they described as the world's first. The researchers posted the formula for the test online and said they expected that countries with strong public health systems would soon be able to produce their own tests. We're more concerned about labs in countries where it's not that easy to transport samples, or staff aren't trained that thoroughly, or if there is a large number of patients who need to be tested. Dr. Christian Drosten, the director of the Institute for Virology at the hospital, known as Charite, or I'm not certain how they pronounce it, but Charite in Berlin. As it turned out, however, the testing problems would not be limited to less developed countries. In the United States, the CDC developed its own test 4 days after the German lab did. That's nice, but... And the delay wasn't huge, but there were problems, of course. CDC officials claimed that the American test would be more accurate than the German one by using 3 genetic sequences to detect the virus rather than 2. The federal government quickly began distributing the American test to state officials, but the test had a flaw. The 3rd genetic sequence produced inconclusive results. So the CDC told state labs to pause their work. In meetings of the White House's coronavirus task force, Dr. Robert Redfield, the CDC director, downplayed the problem and said it would soon be solved. Instead, it took weeks to fix. During that time, the United States had to restrict testing to people who had clear reason to think they had the virus. All the while, the virus was quietly spreading. By early March, with the testing results delays still unresolved, the New York region became a global center of the virus without people realizing it until weeks later. More widespread testing could have made a major difference, experts said, leading to earlier lockdowns and social distancing and ultimately less sickness and death. You can't stop it if you can't see it, Dr. Bruce Aylward, a senior advisor to the Director General of the World Health Organization, said. While the CDC was struggling to solve its testing flaws, Germany was rapidly building up its ability to test. Angela Merkel, a chemist by training, and other political leaders were watching the virus sweep across northern Italy, not far from southern Germany, and pushed for a big expansion of testing. By the time the virus became a problem in Germany, labs around the country had thousands of test kits ready to use. From the beginning, the government covered the cost of the tests. American laboratories often charge patients about $100 for the test. Without free tests, Dr. Hendrik Streeck, director of the Institute of Virology at the University Hospital Bonn, said at the time, a young person with no health insurance and an itchy throat is unlikely to go to the doctor and therefore risk infecting more people. Germany was soon far ahead of other countries in testing. It was able to diagnose asymptomatic cases, trace the contacts of new contacts, and isolate people before they could spread the virus. The country has still suffered a significant outbreak, but it has had many fewer cases per capita than Italy, Spain, France, Britain, or Canada, and about 1/5 the rate of the United States. The United States eventually made up ground on tests. In recent weeks, it has been conducting more per capita than any other country, according to Johns Hopkins researchers. But now there's a new problem. The virus has grown even more rapidly than testing capacity. In recent weeks, Americans have often had to wait in long lines, sometimes in scorching heat, to get those tests. And, of course, then the big delays in getting those results. One measure of the continuing troubles with the testing is the percentage of tests that come back positive. In a country that has the virus under control, fewer than 5% of tests come back positive, according to the World Health Organization guidelines. Many countries have reached that benchmark. The U.S., even with the large recent volumes of tests, has not. We do a lot of testing, according to Johns Hopkins epidemiologists, but the problem is we also have a lot of cases. Trump, of course, thinks it's entirely backwards. We'll be right back after this. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, and I've learned that I either need to update these announcements more often or stop saying that the announcements are brand new. What's not new is that this message, too, is a call for your support in keeping the Kagro in the Morning show on the air. My thanks go out to all of you who do support the show through your donations. The stats say that Kagro in the Morning fans download our program about 2,000 times each weekday, but our donors make up only about 8% of our daily listeners. Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple to make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. If we're helping keep you sane during the Trump era, consider what that's worth. $1 a day? 50 cents? One thin dime? We do about 20 shows a month, so pick a number, do the math, and head to patreon.com/KagroX to let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning show here on Netroots Radio. Still an enormous amount left in this epic recounting of the various angles on the unique failures of the United States and the Trump administration on the coronavirus. Winding up the section about testing problems, we can just say here the huge demand for tests has overwhelmed medical laboratories, and many need days or even up to 2 weeks, which is, of course, the entirety of the incubation period, to produce results. That really is not useful for public health and medical management, Ms. Rivers, the epidemiologist at Johns Hopkins, added. While people are waiting for their results, many are also spreading the virus. In Belgium recently, test results have typically come back in 48 to 72 hours. In Germany and Greece, it is 2 days. In France, the wait is often 24 hours. And remember, in the early days, we were seeing 15-minute results in phone booth size testing centers in South Korea, and that was pretty clearly the key to reopening the economy, being able to test your workers daily as they showed up for work and get results in enough time that they could actually get a full day of work in. Seemed like it was going to be extraordinarily important to reopening the economy, and we just, kind of didn't do it. The rapid tests were apparently reserved for entry into the White House, which hasn't succeeded in keeping coronavirus out of the immediate environs either, but they snapped up all of those. I have not seen or heard stories of anybody getting those rapid tests other than people in and around the White House. There's another section here on the double mask failure, and I think I've been over and over this whole situation about whether or not we should have told people to wear masks from the beginning. I think that looking back on things, we'll all agree that that was largely a mistake and that they should have been clearer in what they meant when they were trying to reserve very, all too rare N95 and above protective equipment for medical workers, which was probably the right thing to do. But we were given initially the message of, well, no other masks are going to protect you, so forget it. Don't bother with the masks. Leave the masks that are out there for the medical workers, when they really should have said, and private efforts did afterwards say, make your own masks. And then, of course, industry in the United States picked up and people began manufacturing cloth face masks for everybody else, but it was too late. And then it had become, by then, a political issue, and they discussed that as part of the double failure as well, that Trump and Trump supporters made a point of resisting masks, whereas everybody else in the world made a point of embracing them. And now we have a huge problem. Let's see, the next section here. The first rule of virus economics being discussed here. Throughout March and April, Governor Brian Kemp of Georgia and staff members held long meetings inside a conference room at the state capitol in Atlanta. They ordered takeout lunches from local restaurants like the Varsity and held 2 daily conference calls with the Public Health Department, the National Guard, and other officials. One of the main subjects of the meetings was when to end Georgia's lockdown and reopen the state's economy. By late April, Mr. Kemp decided that it was time. Georgia had not met the reopening criteria laid out by the Trump administration, and many outside health experts considered those criteria too lax. The state was reporting about 700 new cases a day, more than when it shut down on April 3rd. Nonetheless, Mr. Kemp went ahead. He said that Georgia's economy could not wait any longer, and it became one of the first states to reopen. I don't give a damn about politics right now, he said at an April 20th news conference announcing the reopening. He went on to describe business owners with employees at home who were going broke, worried about whether they can feed their children, make the mortgage payment. Of course, you could have suspended those, but whatever. 4 days later, across Georgia, barbers returned to their chairs wearing face masks and latex gloves. Gyms and bowling alleys were allowed to reopen. Don't forget the tattoo parlors. Followed by restaurants on April 27th. The stay-at-home order expired on April 30th. Kemp's decision was part of a pattern. Across the United States, caseloads were typically much higher when the economy reopened than in other countries. As the United States endured weeks of closed stores and rising unemployment this spring, many politicians, particularly Republicans like Mr. Kemp, argued that there was an unavoidable trade-off between public health and economic health. And if crushing the virus meant ruining the economy, maybe the side effects of the treatment were worse than the disease. Dan Patrick, Republican Lieutenant Governor of Texas, put the case most bluntly and became an object of scorn, especially from the political left, for doing so. There are more important things than living, Mr. Patrick said in a television interview at the same week that Mr. Kemp reopened Georgia. How do you even get around that? It may have been an inartful line, but Mr. Patrick's full argument was not wholly dismissive of human life. He was instead suggesting that the human costs of shutting down the economy, the losses of jobs and incomes, and the associated damages to living standards and people's health were greater than the costs of a virus that kills only a small percentage of people who get it. Good job normalizing that one here, guys. We are crushing the economy, he said, citing the damage to his own children and grandchildren. We've got to take some risks and get back in the game and get this country back up and running, because it is a game after all. The trouble with the argument, epidemiologists and economists agree, was that public health and the economy's health were not really in conflict. Early in the pandemic, Austin Goolsbee, a University of Chicago economist and former Obama administration official, proposed what he called the first rule of virus economics. The best way to fix the economy is to get control of the virus, he said. Until the virus was under control, many people would be afraid to resume normal life, and the economy would not function normally. The events of the last few months have borne out Mr. Goolsbee's predictions. Even before states announced shutdown orders in the spring, many families began sharply reducing their spending. They were responding to their own worries about the virus, not any government policy. And the end of the lockdowns, like Georgia's, did not fix the economy's problems either. It instead led to a brief increase in spending and hiring that soon faded. In the weeks after states reopened, the virus began surging. Those that reopened earliest tended to have the worst outbreaks. According to a Times analysis, the Southeast fared especially badly. Moving on, I guess just a little more further on down. The message is the response is in the next section. The United States has not performed uniquely poorly on every measure of the virus response. Mask wearing is more common than throughout much of Scandinavia and Australia, according to surveys by YouGov and the Imperial College London. The total death rate is still higher in Spain, Italy, and Britain, but there is one way, in addition to the scale of the continuing outbreaks and deaths, that the United States stands apart. In no other high-income country have the messages from political leaders been nearly so mixed and confusing. These messages, in turn, have been amplified by television stations and websites friendly to the Republican Party, especially Fox News and the Sinclair Broadcast Group, which operates almost 200 local stations. To anybody listening to the country's politicians or watching those television stations, it would have been difficult to know how to respond to the virus. Trump's comments in particular have regularly contradicted the views of scientists and medical experts. You know all about all of those. Let's see. Some in-depth discussion about all of the many ways in which he undermined the scientific evidence and the scientific community on the virus. But I think at this point, you get the gist of it. It is a very long article. I suggest that you take a look all the way through it. Some specifics that we skipped over will likely be valuable. But leads me to, well, I would like to get to a couple other important pieces of news, some of which are longer and some of which are, well, shorter. And one of the shorter pieces of some interest, I think, here, reported by TPM, and a number of outlets had the news that this was coming yesterday, but here the upshot: Deutsche Bank provided New York prosecutors with Trump's financial records. So I guess that deed is done. Christina Cabrera reporting for, is it a direct reporting for TPM here? I think so. Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance successfully subpoenaed Deutsche Bank, President Donald Trump's top lender, last year in his criminal investigation into Trump's business dealings, according to a new report. The New York Times reported on Wednesday that Deutsche Bank provided the financial records Trump had used to obtain loans to the Manhattan DA's office over the course of several months in 2019. The subpoena seemed to be a part of a criminal investigation into the Trump Organization for bank and insurance fraud that state prosecutors hinted at in a court filing earlier this week. Revelations of Deutsche Bank's complying with the subpoena came as Trump persistently stonewalls efforts by prosecutors and Congress to obtain his tax returns. Last month, the Supreme Court rejected Trump's claim that he was exempt from state grand jury subpoenas as the president. However, the ruling left the door open for Trump to keep tangling up the courts with lawsuits against the subpoenas. So you can bet that he will, in fact, be taking advantage of that opportunity and continuing to bog things down until after the election in an effort to survive. Now, speaking of after the election, if the election goes well, Greg Sargent, who has been very good at keeping up with the extent of the constitutional emergency all along, has this piece to share with us today. If Biden wins, the post-Trump corruption purge will have to be epic. I don't know anybody that actually believes that the Democrats are up to the task of this, but, well, certainly Republicans aren't going to conduct it at all. But I think we all expect to be disappointed by Democratic office holders in terms of the breadth and depth of the investigative work and the aggressiveness with which they intend to pursue it. But we're left with no alternative at the moment, but except to advocate the way Greg does here in this piece for more aggressive response. This is how he puts it here. It's widely understood that if Joe Biden wins the White House, he'll face monumental tasks in digging us out of our spiraling public health crisis and the economic catastrophe it has unleashed, which could get far worse if Congress's next rescue package falls short, as it likely will. But an incoming Biden administration will also face another mission: undertaking a full accounting of the Trump administration's corruption and the damage it has done to our government and institutions. That is, if the new administration chooses to accept that mission. And we're not sure that they will just yet. A new report from the Democratic-allied Center for American Progress both lays out an argument for why Biden should indeed take on that mission and offers a suggested roadmap on how to do that. I do feel like we're fighting the 2009 battle all over again with one of the participants in that battle. So we'll see whether there's daylight between the two of them, or if, like Barack Obama, Biden has come along in understanding what we've been driving at the whole time, as Barack Obama did the other day indicated the other day, at least with respect to reform of the filibuster in the Senate. This, too, was something we pushed on his administration in 2009 and were, rebuffed. Anyway, the core argument for acting ambitiously to fumigate the Trump administration's corruption is a straightforward moral hazard one. according to the CAP report here. And here the excerpt. A constant of the Trump administration has been escalation in the absence of accountability. If a free pass is provided to those that broke the law and subverted democracy, it will embolden them and any illiberal politicians or administrations in the future to show even greater disregard for the rule of law. Why, it's almost as if I had written a report myself, which I did not, but it's almost as if I had written it 12 years ago, which I guess I did in that sense. Anyway, one question that will be tough to answer is where to start. That is a good question. The CAP report suggests beginning with the Justice Department, with a full review of special treatment accorded to Trump allies such as Roger Stone and former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, both of whom Trump championed. Also worth examining might be the Attorney General's efforts to discredit his own agency's conclusions about a massive foreign attack on our democracy, as Trump implicitly but relentlessly demanded. But crucially, CAP suggests that such a review must not involve the White House at all. It would instead involve career Justice Department officials or the Inspector General, and Congress, if it's controlled by Democrats, would potentially have a major role. Which immediately highlights an interesting conundrum: to what degree members of a Biden administration could undertake such an internal examination without involving Biden in any way, since that would risk straying into the sort of politicization that is the problem under Trump. Another area for such fumigation might be the president's constant attacks on inspectors general and whistleblowers. This is one of the clearest areas in which Trump has sought to wreck one of the most important anti-corruption and pro-accountability innovations of the post-Watergate era. One answer to this, suggested CAP, would be to try to reinvigorate the role of Inspector General, or Inspectors General, I guess. This could, of course, be done through the act of respecting their independence, but also explicitly and actively reaffirming that independence. CAP suggests that major agencies should conduct their own internal reviews of corruption that took place under Trump. EPA is an obvious candidate, he notes here, which could theoretically involve Inspectors General, revitalizing their role in that way. Yet another area, not discussed in the CAP report, would entail new legislative safeguards against the sort of relentless financial self-dealing that Trump engaged in. A model is Senator Elizabeth Warren's blueprint for requiring the IRS to release presidential tax returns, presidential candidates' tax returns. Such an effort would be led out of Congress, would be, I guess he means to say it would be out of Congress that such a effort would be led, not that it would be done outside of Congress. But Biden would surely be pressed to bless and then sign it. This is, of course, a very partial list of what might need to be done, but the very fact that a mainstream outfit such as CAP is already pushing Biden in this way suggests he and or members of his administration may feel great pressure to act along these lines. Many other stakeholders in Washington who have been glaring at Trump's contempt for the rule of law from the sidelines for so long will also surely offer their own blueprints, adding to the chatter around what will be a huge national debate should Biden win. And yet, having campaigned on a vow of post-Trump reconciliation and facing the daunting task of unifying a battered country around national solutions to the coronavirus pandemic and a potential economic depression, Biden might feel disinclined from sinking too much political capital into an effort along these lines, which might feel akin to diving right back into Trump's black hole. The CAP report tries to address this, arguing that ultimately it's more divisive and risky to allow all this corruption to slide, and that in the end, reaffirming the rule of law should itself constitute a unifying act. Of course, Trump himself will make this as hard as possible. As the report notes, Richard Nixon resigned from office in disgrace, providing some measure of accountability for his actions. By contrast, Trump will steadily rage about any such efforts at an accounting from his private life. His Twitter thumbs are as active as ever, and GOP opportunists in the Senate who see advocating for the lost cause of Trumpism as their path to glory in 2024 will add to the bellowing. All of which is a reminder of the vast scale of the garbage field will all be digging out from under should Biden win. And that's if we're lucky. Doesn't sound very lucky, but good points. Feel like we've made them in the past. Worth reiterating. At least a little bit before heading into the wrap-up of today's show. In other coronavirus news, because again, it's all coronavirus news, I noticed this piece from the DCist, local publication of interest here, but with wider application. In case you were wondering, why do we have this unique problem of being unable to suppress the virus? Here's another factor in the answer, not just Trump himself, but although I do think that a lot of this stems from Trump's general attitude and approach to the virus and any policy that you might be able to discern in terms of fighting against it. But this piece is titled "An Increasing Number of Infectious People Have Dined at Restaurants," city officials say. Matt Blitz is the writer here. Again, DCist, DCIST.com is the source. Contact tracing has revealed that an, quote, increasing number of individuals have dined at DC restaurants while infectious with COVID-19 in recent weeks. Why do they do that? It's something that they should not do, right? Why would it happen? Well, before we get to that, in addition, tracing has shown that a number of individuals were infectious while recently being in the workplace, according to city officials. At the mayor's press conference on Wednesday, DC Health Director LaQuandra Nesbitt noted that 10% of positive individuals told contact tracers that they had traveled within 2 weeks of being diagnosed. These findings come just over a week after the mayor's office said anyone traveling to the district from any of 27 states deemed high risk must quarantine for 14 days. Of course, there's no enforcement mechanism, so they just don't. This includes Delaware, which is quite popular with Washingtonians as a summer vacation spot due to its waterside towns like Rehoboth Beach and Bethany Beach. Many of the findings are in line with what Maryland also revealed last week. A large portion of people who gave Maryland contact tracers information about their activities had attended family gatherings and worked outside the home. In large part, our trends are not dissimilar to what's happening in Maryland and other jurisdictions, Nesbitt said. While performing contact tracing, the city said they look at two different categories: activities in the 2 weeks prior to diagnosis, when the virus could be incubating, and activities while actually infectious. Both have given officials concern in terms of the spread of the virus in the district. As with many other places in the country, statistics in D.C. have shown that the number of positive cases for younger people is increasing. I thought they were immune. While the likelihood of death may be lower, it doesn't necessarily mean that severe illness or death doesn't occur in younger populations, Nesbitt said. She also continued to caution that younger people who are infected, particularly those who live in intergenerational homes, can easily introduce infections and widespread transmission to people who may be more at risk of severe illness or death. It is not a benign issue for young people to be the primary spreaders in communities, Nesbitt said. In late June, D.C. moved into Phase 2 of reopening, which allowed for limited capacity indoor dining, slightly larger gatherings, and for non-essential retail businesses to open. However, since that time, cases have continued to rise, and D.C.'s data shows an increasing trend in cases in the community dating back to the beginning of July. With the new data presented Wednesday, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser was asked if the city will reconsider allowing indoor dining. "We are watching very closely several activities," Bowser said. "We are making sure people are following the rules, except the thing is that the whole article is about the fact that you are discovering that people are not following the rules." And I here, to tie it back to the Trump administration response to things, I think the lax response, the push for reopening, the ambiguity about masks, and the weird emphasis on the things that we're pushing to reopen, like dining indoors in a restaurant, opening gyms, opening bars. I think basically the reaction is people, they look to we've been conditioned and maybe spoiled by the fact that we've had functional federal governments in the past in situations like this, looking to the federal government for cues about how to respond. And I think, despite all the evidence to the contrary, there's plenty of people who still believe, well, look, if the government says it can reopen, that must mean it's safe to do. And then not putting that necessarily together with the fact that, hey, I've just been tested for COVID-19 because I suspect I've been exposed to it or I have the symptoms. First, we started to hear about people who didn't self-quarantine prior to receiving their results, even though they felt sick. And how dumb is that? But again, people were like, well, when I get official word that I have it, then I'll self-quarantine. No, you're supposed to quarantine now while you think you have it out of an abundance of caution. But that actually, I don't know, that message just never really got received by people. Then, of course, we opened up the restaurants and people said, well, if the restaurants are open, it must be safe to go in them because the government would never allow them to reopen if it wasn't safe. That's probably a bad assumption all by itself. But adding on top of that, well, if it's open, then people are allowed to go to it. And I'm a people, so I'm going to go. Yes, but you suspect that you have COVID-19 or have just been diagnosed with having COVID-19 because your test came back positive. That means you can't go to this restaurant, but it's open, so it must be safe. Yes, but it's not open to you. You have COVID-19. Well, I don't know whether they even get so far as to think, well, that's discriminatory. I ought to be able to go. And besides, won't a mask protect me and or other people? And we should all be wearing masks, and I'll wear masks until the food gets there, and then I'll take the mask off. And how many people could I infect while I'm eating? It's just a short time. I don't know how you get to the conclusion that it's going to be okay for me to go, even COVID positive, to a restaurant. But my fear is that the realities just haven't been communicated clearly and effectively to anybody anywhere. And so people are just saying, well, if it's there, it must be safe. And I'm here. It's here. There's really no reason why I shouldn't be allowed to go in there. And what business is it of everyone else breathing in my germs anyway? Just don't do it. Wear your masks and I'll wear mine and you won't get sick, except it doesn't work that way and the virus doesn't care. So I don't know. I just think there's more blame for the Trump administration there in not communicating clearly to people than they're willing to give them in this. But again, certainly people are being very stupid and they're responsible for their own stupidity. But I think the source of their stupidity in many cases is a federal government that tells them it's okay to be stupid. So I think that's problematic. CNN reporting yesterday, this won't be news to you, but I'll give you the headline. A lot of people talked about this one as well. Trump still not grasping the severity of the pandemic, source tells CNN, or as I put it, Trump not grasping the severity of the pandemic, eyeballs tell brain. Anyone who looks at it can see it. But I did see an interesting response to it, and I'm thinking, was it Eric Boehlert who made this response to it, saying, listen, it's not Trump not being able to grasp the severity of the pandemic, as he doesn't care about the severity of the pandemic. That's perhaps a debatable point, but a good one nonetheless. It's a good observation. You should take it alongside your regularly prescribed grain of salt with everything else. But yes, if best case scenario is he's still too dumb to understand what's going on. That's the best case that can be made. The darker case is he doesn't care and never did. Also very interesting. By the way, in further school reopening failures, we have another one out of North Carolina, this one notable because of a connection with Mike Pence. ABC News reporting students at a school touted by Pence for reopening must quarantine due to COVID-19, which also rhymes. Very nice. Fourth graders at a school in North Carolina have been asked to quarantine for 14 days after a student there tested positive for COVID-19. The school, a Thales Academy, Thales, I don't know, in Wake Forest, said it notified on Monday that the student became infected after having a contact with an infected family member. And yeah, that's the way those things will go. The student was asymptomatic and was at school on Friday. That was the last time they were in, and so they had to notify everybody. Teachers who were also exposed will also be quarantined. It is a private, non-sectarian school with apparently 8 locations in North Carolina. And it made news last week after Vice President Mike Pence and Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos visited a classroom and applauded the school for reopening. Although you should note for the record that Pence and DeVos visited a campus in Apex, North Carolina, not the Wake Forest location where they discovered the students positive with COVID-19. But they made a big deal out of it, of course, and said, look, we're here today because we need to open up America. And if we're going to do that, we got to open America's schools. And Fales Academy is literally in the forefront, Pence said. And it's true, but he didn't really need to emphasize it with the literally. I am here. You are open, right? Pence also said the administration was going to make sure schools had the resources to open safely. We really do believe that it's in the best interest of our children to be back in the classroom, the vice president added. And I think everybody believes that. The question is, will you find a way to do it safely? And the answer is no, because a week later, the very same system you visited was discovering COVID-19 positivity among its student bodies. So there's just no way to do it. You should probably admit that at some point. Okay, that's it for us today. Time to hand things over to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. And, all right, I'll press the right button eventually, and we'll figure out what he's got on tap for you that I didn't get to, and some of which I did, but which he'll approach from a different and unique angle. I guarantee it.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
All right, ready for this? In a rare disclosure, the State Department revealed Russia is using a well-developed militarized online disinformation operation around the pandemic. A lengthy FBI affidavit detailed how multiple GOP groups were involved in Ohio's $60 million fraud scheme. Remember that one? More to come on that from Justice next.